I'm a recreational diver, been doing it for about 5 years now. Mostly reefs, wrecks, the usual stuff. Always loved the feeling of being weightless, the quiet hum of the regulator, the whole underwater world thing. I always stayed within my limits, never pushed it. Until it happened. So last summer I decided to hit up this lake I'd heard about in northern Michigan. Supposed to have crystal clear water and some interesting rock formations. Perfect for a few days of diving and relaxing. I get there, set up camp, and the next morning I'm ready to go. The water was even clearer than I expected. Visibility was insane. I started exploring the shoreline, just cruising along when I saw it. It was an opening barely big enough to squeeze through, hidden behind some algae-covered rocks. A cave. Now I'm not a cave diver, never been trained, never had the gear. But something about this cave just drew me in. It was like a dark, silent invitation. I knew I shouldn't, but the curiosity was overwhelming. I rationalized it. It's probably just a small cave, I thought. I'll just peek in, see what's there, and come right back out. Famous last words, right? I took a deep breath, checked my air, and squeezed through the opening. It was immediately darker, colder. My dive light cut through the water, revealing smooth, gray rock. The cave sloped downwards, and as I swam deeper, the opening behind me started to shrink into a small speck of light. The cave started to widen, opening into a larger chamber. The water was still crystal clear, but something felt wrong. The silence was heavier. The air from my regulator tasted metallic. I shone my light around the chamber. It was completely barren, just smooth rock walls, no life, no debris, just emptiness. I was starting to get uneasy. I told myself to turn back, but then I saw it. In the far corner of the chamber, there was another opening smaller than the first, but still big enough to swim through. And beyond that opening, I could see something, a faint flickering light. I should have turned back, I know that now, but I couldn't resist. I had to know what that light was. I swam towards the second opening, my heart pounding in my chest. Squeezing through the second opening, I found myself in an even larger chamber, and in the center of the chamber, bathed in an eerie green light, was a thing. I don't know what else to call it. It was a structure made of some kind of black, obsidian-like material. It was vaguely pyramidal in shape, but the angles were all wrong, unsettling. The surface was covered in strange symbols like nothing I'd ever seen before, and it pulsed with that green light. A sickening, rhythmic pulse that seemed to vibrate through the water and into my bones. I was frozen staring at this thing. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The air tasted even more metallic now, and I felt the pressure building in my head. It was like the structure was radiating something evil. Then I saw the eyes. They were embedded in the sides of the structure, two on each face, staring out into the darkness. They weren't made of stone. They were organic. Pale, milky white with black vertical pupils that dilated and contracted with the pulsing green light. I finally snapped out of it, sheer terror overriding my paralysis. I spun around, kicking wildly, desperate to get out of that chamber. I swam back through the second opening, back into the first chamber, back towards the entrance. But something was different. The water was no longer clear. It was murky, filled with sediment. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. My dive light was useless. Panic clawed at my throat. I was disoriented, lost. I couldn't find the opening. I was swimming blindly, bumping into the walls of the cave. My air was running low. Then I felt something brush against my leg. I screamed, a muffled sound that was swallowed by the water. I kicked out, but whatever it was gone. I kept swimming faster now, more frantic. But the feeling of being watched, of something lurking in the darkness, was overwhelming. Then I felt it again. Something wrapping around my ankle. I thrashed, trying to shake it off, but it held on tight. I looked down, but I couldn't see anything in the murky water. And then it started to pull. It was pulling me down deeper into the cave. I clawed at the walls, desperate to hold on, but the grip on my ankle was too strong. I was being dragged into the darkness towards something unspeakable. Just when I thought I was going to die, my foot came free. I kicked off the wall, swimming upwards with everything I had. I broke the surface, gasping for air, my lungs burning. I was out of the cave. I scrambled out of the water, collapsing on the shore, shivering and gasping for breath. I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I reached my campsite. I packed up my gear, got in my car, and drove away. I didn't stop until I was miles away from that lake. I haven't been diving since. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was nitrogen narcosis. Maybe I hallucinated the whole thing. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And I know that something in that cave is still waiting. I still have nightmares about the green light, the pulsing structure, the eyes. and sometimes when I'm alone in the dark, I feel something brush against my ankle. The limestone maw yawned before them, its jagged teeth dripping with condensation. The cave, known to the locals as La Boca del Diablo, had been the site of numerous disappearances over the years. But for Andrew and his team of cave divers, it was an irresistible challenge. A labyrinth of underwater tunnels, undiscovered passages, and the promise of breaking new ground in the diving community was too much to pass up. Andrew, seasoned and fearless, adjusted his mask and turned to his companions. Sarah, his longtime diving partner, checked the oxygen levels one last time. Beside her, Dan, their newest team member, fidgeted nervously. The guide, an old local named Miguel, stood at the cave's entrance, refusing to step any further. "The devil lives here," Miguel muttered. "You go in, you might not come out." Andrew smirked. "We'll be careful." Miguel shook his head, made the sign of the cross, and walked away. The team descended into the darkness, the sound of water sloshing around their ankles the only farewell. The first few meters were easy. They waded through a narrow passage, the cold water climbing their bodies inch by inch. Their flashlights danced along the walls, revealing eerie formations that looked like frozen screams. Then the tunnel dipped, forcing them to submerge entirely. The world above vanished, replaced by the thick, crushing silence of the deep. Their breathing became rhythmic, a steady exhalation of bubbles that twisted toward the surface. The cave opened into a massive chamber, its ceiling barely visible above the waterline. Stalactites hung like daggered fingers, and below, the network of tunnels that stretched endlessly into the unknown. Andrew led the way, careful to follow the guideline they had attached at the entrance. The first tunnel was tight, barely wide enough for them to squeeze through. It twisted and turned, and as they pushed forward, the rock walls seemed to close in, pressing against their bodies like an ancient living thing. Dan hesitated, his breathing rapid. "I don't like this," he signaled with his flashlight. A diver, motionless, suspended in the water like a marionette with invisible strings. Andrew felt his stomach tighten. The suit was old, covered in algae, and the mask was cracked, revealing empty sockets where eyes should have been. A long-forgotten corpse, perhaps one of the lost divers from years past, or something else. Sarah reached out as if to confirm the figure's reality, but the moment her fingers brushed against the fabric, it moved. Not a drift from the current, not the sluggish pull of decay, it moved. The head snapped toward them, the cracked mask splintering further. A hand twitched, a slow, jerking motion, unnatural and deliberate. Dan screamed, an explosion of bubbles that vanished into the abyss. He thrashed, kicking backward, his flashlight flickering wildly. His foot caught on a jagged rock, and suddenly his mask filled with red. Panic overtook him. He clawed at his mask, his eyes wide with terror. But before Andrew or Sarah could reach him, the darkness swallowed him. He was gone, yanked into one of the tunnels by an unseen force. Andrew and Sarah hesitated only a moment before chasing after him. The guideline, their only tether to safety, was forgotten. The tunnel twisted, turned, shrank. Water pressed in, thick and suffocating. A shape loomed ahead. Not Dan, the corpse, the diver, but it wasn't floating anymore. It was crawling toward them, its fingers digging into the stone, its head lolling at an unnatural angle. The mask split apart, revealing a grin, too wide, too sharp, too alive. The whispering returned, and now deafening, filling their minds with unintelligible words. Andrew clutched his head, his vision spinning. Sarah convulsed, her body jerking violently, then silence. Andrew's eyes fluttered open. He was alone. His flashlight flickered weakly, revealing nothing but the empty, endless tunnels. He turned in frantic circles, searching for the guideline, for Sarah, for any sign of where he was. And then he saw it, the reflection in the murky water. Behind him, the diver loomed, its gaping mouth releasing a cloud of darkness that seeped into the water, swallowing the light. Andrew kicked, trying to swim away, but his limbs felt heavy, sluggish. The water was no longer just water. It was thick, almost sentient, pulling him down. A hand grasped his ankle. Cold, clawing, dragging. His last breath erupted from his lungs in a silent scream. Then there was nothing but the cave. The limestone maw yawned once more, the water still and undisturbed. Outside, Miguel stood at the entrance, staring into the abyss. He sighed, shook his head, and walked away. The cave always took what it was owed. The entrance to the cave was nothing more than a black slit in the rock, a wound in the earth that bled cold, stagnant air. Beneath the surface, past the jagged teeth of stone, the tunnel stretched into the abyss. No sunlight, no sound, only the heavy weight of water and the infinite dark. James adjusted his mask, the glass fogging slightly from his breath. He had been on dives before, many in fact, but none as deep, none as foreboding as the gullet. The cave was infamous among divers, its passages mapped only partially. Legends surrounded it. Some said the tunnels moved, shifting like living veins beneath the rock. Others whispered about the divers who had gone in and never returned, their bodies never recovered. James didn't believe in ghost stories. He believed in preparation and discipline and skill. And that's why he was here, to chart the uncharted, to push further than anyone else had dared. His team was small. Rachel, his second in command, a brilliant navigator. Victor, their equipment expert. And then there was Daniel, an old friend, though something about him had changed lately. He had grown quiet, distant. He had been the one to insist on this dive, almost as if the cave had been calling to him. They submerged, their bodies cutting through the cold like knives. The descent was immediate, the cave mouth swallowing them whole. The walls pulsed with eerie formations, shadows that stretched and recoiled under their beams. The water was thick, murky, as if disturbed by something unseen. The deeper they went, the stronger the sense of wrongness became. The silence wasn't just silence. It was oppressive, a force of its own. James checked his gauges. Everything normal. Yet the further they swam, the more his body protested, as if the water itself wanted them gone. Rachel signaled to the left, a side tunnel, narrower than the main one, but leading deeper. The plan was to stick together, to explore only what was mapped, but Daniel didn't hesitate. He veered off before James could stop him, his silhouette vanishing into the dark. James cursed and followed, the others close behind. The tunnel was tight, the walls closing in. Something scraped against his back, just the rock, but it felt like fingers. They emerged into a chamber larger than any they had seen before. The water here was oddly still, too still, like a void. Their lights barely penetrated it, the darkness swallowing everything. Then they saw them, figures floating in the distance. At first, James thought they were bodies, but they weren't still. They twitched, jerked, their movements unnatural, like puppets hanging on invisible strings. Their eyes were empty sockets, their mouths open as if screaming, yet no bubbles rose. No sound escaped. Daniel moved forward, as if entranced. James grabbed his arm, shaking his head violently, but Daniel's eyes, they were different now, wide, unblinking, and then, without warning, he yanked away, swimming toward the figures. Rachel tried to grab him, but he was too fast. He disappeared into the black. James swore under his breath. This wasn't right. This wasn't just a cave. Something was watching. Victor tapped his shoulder and pointed at the rock wall. Carvings. Ancient, crude depictions of people with hollow faces, reaching toward something in the dark. Below them, a single word scratched into the stone. Hungered out of a current surged through the chamber, stronger than before, tugging at them like unseen hands. Their lights flickered. The figures in the distance began to move, not drifting, but closing in, their bodies twitching, their faces frozen in agonized expressions. James grabbed Rachel and Victor and signaled to retreat. Now they turned, kicking hard, but the current grew stronger. The cave didn't want them to leave. It was pulling them deeper. Something brushed James's leg. A hand. Not human. It was slick, elongated, the fingers too many, wrapping around his ankle. He thrashed, his knife flashing as he sliced through the darkness. The grip loosened, but the water around him churned with movement. Shapes emerged from the walls, from the floor, from the very shadows. A Victor screamed, bubbles erupting violently as something yanked him into the depths. Rachel reached for him, but he was gone. Just gone. James grabbed her wrist and kicked hard, forcing them forward. The tunnel twisted and pulsed as if alive, but they didn't stop. They couldn't. The entrance loomed ahead, a distant light, salvation. But behind them, the things were coming, fast, hungry. Rachel was ahead of him, almost free. Then she screamed, a choked, garbled sound. Her body jerked violently as unseen hands pulled her backward. James lunged, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting moment before she was swallowed by the dark. She was gone. James didn't look back. He forced himself through the tunnel, his lungs burning, his mind screaming. The exit was there. He could make it as something latched onto his back. He felt the weight, the cold, the wet breath against his neck, a whisper inside his skull, clawing at his mind. Stay! He erupted from the water, gasping, the world spinning. He clawed at the rock, dragging himself out. The cave entrance was still, silent, the water placid as if nothing had happened. He turned, expecting to see them, expecting hands to reach for him. But there was nothing, no Rachel, no Victor, no Daniel, only the cave, and then he saw it. His reflection in the water, a face that wasn't his own, a grin too wide, too sharp, a whisper in his head, next time you'll stay. And deep below in the abyss, something laughed.